It's crazy. And really, it should be known and sent to the dustbin of stupid ideas. The interesting thing is that we've seen a major tragedy of decommoning in the sea. And it started really with what was called the Great Acceleration after the Second World War. There was a fear of famine, there was a fear of that we needed food, and governments started to give huge subsidies to technologies and long-distance fishing capacities. And as a result of that period, purse-seine nets developed, well over a mile long, catching everything in their wake. Long lines of 10,000 hooks lasting 20 miles have developed. Whole series of fads, fishing aggregation devices developed, and there are now well over 100,000 out there in the sea. In the course of my research for this book, I've been off about 20 countries, and often I've bumped into some of these fishing aggregation devices, and they're left to just escape when the company is fed up with them and they've got something better. They go off and they cause a lot more pollution. So the initial period of the Great Acceleration was what I call a neo-mercantilist period. And it was an encroachment because gradually fishing was going further and further from the shores. The more conflicts out in the sea between countries from different nations and so on. And it was a period of encroachment. But the big event started with enclosure. I ask in the book, the chapter begins, who owns the sea? Who owns the sea? Well, I can give you a more nuanced answer. Justine and Codex said it was the commons. But in 1945, imperialistically, the United States said, we are going to take our territory way out to sea, effectively 200 nautical miles, in what's called the Truman Proclamation. They acted imperialistically. We won the war, we're going to demand, and we extend our territory by that amount. Promptly, several other countries started doing it, Chile, Peru, and so on. This led to gradual tensions until the passage of UNCLOS, which was 1982. I gave a talk in the House of Commons recently. When I mentioned the word UNCLOS, I could see the blare, oh, fuck's that, you know, across people's face. Now, UNCLOS was described by the UN Secretary General at the time as the most significant legal instrument of the 20th century. And I agree with him 100%. And what UNCLOS did was try to resolve the increasing tensions in the world's seas. And the first thing it did was introduce the biggest enclosure in the history of humanity. An incredible enclosure. Because what it did was that it said that every coastal country could have 200 nautical miles from their shores would become part of their state territory. Okay? Now, if I ask you which country did best out of this, I don't think you'd guess. I certainly wouldn't have done, so I'm not being too clever by half. It's France. Because France had a lot of islands around the place. They got nearly 12 million square kilometers of seabed. The United States got 11.4. They were number 2. Then Russia and Australia, and Britain came in 5th. Not too bad, given that we gained, on that stroke of a pen in 1982, 6.8 million square kilometers of seabed. That meant that the sea is 27 times as large as our land area. That's a huge change, right? And you go down the list of countries that did very well, and you get sort of way down the list, and you find that little country called China. That little country called China got less than 1 million. Now, that you have to bear that in mind when you think of what the geopolitical tensions taking place in the South Pacific and elsewhere. Now, the enclosure was arbitrary, 200 nautical miles, why? But they added on that if you had a continental shelf that was larger, you could get up to 350. And some countries have been doing precisely that. Now, the UNCLOS, which is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, was a set of messy compromises. They had to get agreement from 160 plus countries. Eventually we got a ratification by 167 plus the European Union, but one country refused. That country was the United States. So it's taken the benefits but hasn't gone for the commitments. And it was a set of messy compromises. The countries with coasts got their EEZs, exclusive economic zones, of 200. The great powers got the rights of navigation all over the world. The countries that were landlocked, 43 of them, also got the promise, as every other country got, that if there was deep sea mining, then there had to be a sharing mechanism for the benefit of all humanity, for the common good of humanity, that had to be respected for all as equals, and there had to be a mining code developed. And what this did, I'll come back to that story in a minute, but I just want to go through what's happened with fishing, and then aquaculture, and then mining, and then I'll come to my proposals. First of all, part of UNCLOS was designed, in effect, to respect a nutcase, a main man named Wilbert Chapman. And Wilbert Chapman was one of the first of the US administration's people to be a nominated specialist for the sea. In 1949, he must have had a few drinks, I think. In 1949, he devised a concept of the maximum sustainable yield, MSY. And the maximum sustainable yield, he put it as an inverted U shape. I'm sure it was the back of an N, but it had to be. And like that. So basically he said it's just as bad to underfish as it is to overfish. The thing is, you should get that. And the reason was, he said, it's very healthy. He must have been a Malthusian as well. It's very healthy to thin the fish populations, because you will then catch all the old, infertile, fat fish and leave more space for the young, virile fish to breed. Now, I mean, this must have struck somebody as mad at the time, but it's the tragedy is it's still used to determine what amount of fish should be caught out there. It's crazy. And really, it should be known and sent to the dustbin of stupid ideas. But it went into UNCLOS because there's a clause there saying that any country that technologically cannot catch to the MSY has to make a long-term fishing agreement with a foreign country that can do that. So as a result, there are 300 or more fishing access agreements, most of which are non-transparent, not known to anybody except the negotiators and the people who've taken the bribes, and they've resulted in a plunder of fish populations all over the world, chronically as such. And of course, governments, including our own wonderful government, has often defended if their long-distance fishers ever get any threat, they come to their aid against the developing country. It is a real shock. Now, the second pit about fishing, where Boris Johnson, the late lamented Boris Johnson, was characteristically economical with the truth. And we have a quota system. Quite a few countries now have quota systems. The idea of a quota is that private property rights lead to long-term investment, because your private property owners will want to make long-term profits. It's a lousy theory, but that was the theory, is the theory. And quota systems mean you determine which fishing company gets what percentage of the total catch. So we have a system that began in 1967, actually, but developed much later and took refinement in the 1990s, and then refinement under this current government. And we have a quota system whereby 25 companies own over 2/3 of all the fish. In other words, they can catch all that fish, but the little people can't. 5 of them are in the Sunday Times rich list. They're among the richest people in this country. I wonder why. And the irony is that those big industrial fishes have been caught repeatedly in breaking the law. And there's a famous case in Scotland, the Blackfish scam of 2011, where they were caught, some of the biggest companies, landing £63 million worth of clandestine, overfished, illegally caught fish. They were fined, but then allowed to keep their quota. Now, for me, this is a ridiculous thing. It should be a crime. Okay? You are destroying nature. You are destroying the reproduction. You are making sure that my children, your children, won't have that fish to eat. So it's a real scandal. Now, I won't go on there. There are more details on that. But what's happened with fishing is the last part of the story, because increasingly finance has moved in to take control. So we have a lovely concept now, slipper skippers. Slipper skippers. These are people who own the quota, but they lease it out to a big company, a finance company, or behind the scene of finance, and they go off into Florida or somewhere like that, stay up in a veranda, and take the rents from the fishing. Now, the last part of the fishing story that I want to mention is that another case of Boris Johnson being economical with the truth. He claimed that we have 26% of all our sea in marine protected areas. We're the world leader, he said. But actually, as I show, industrial scale fishing is more intensive in our marine protected areas than outside it, with bottom trawling and destruction of ecosystems and so on. The second story.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.